The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Starfleet has catalogued thousands of anomalies, charted the edges of known space, and made contact with hundreds of civilizations across 2 quadrants. But what happens when something defies every sensor array, every tricorder reading, every rational explanation the Federation has ever constructed? What happens when 2 beings step out of the impossible and into the very heart of the Enterprise-D, carrying with them something that science has no name for? Captain Jean-Luc Picard had faced the Borg. He had stood before Q. He had wrestled with temporal paradoxes that bent the mind to its breaking point. Nothing in his 30 years of Starfleet service prepared him for the moment the transporter room reported an unauthorized materialization on Deck 6. Not a transporter beam, not a shuttle, not any known form of conveyance. 2 figures simply appeared, as though the fabric of the ship had parted to admit them. The Enterprise-D was 3 days out from Starbase 74, conducting a standard survey of the Devron system near the Romulan neutral zone, when the anomaly first registered on long-range sensors. Lieutenant Commander Data had described it with characteristic precision. A subspace shear of unknown origin, exhibiting energy signatures consistent with no catalogued phenomenon in Starfleet's database. The rift had lasted exactly 4.7 seconds. Then it collapsed. And somewhere deep in the ship, in a maintenance corridor on Deck 6, 2 robed figures stood in the dim light of the Enterprise, breathing recycled air for the first time. Yoda moved first. 900 years of living had given the Jedi Grand Master an instinct for danger that operated well below conscious thought. His eyes, large, ancient, and luminously green, swept the corridor with calm precision. The hum of the ship surrounded them, a vast mechanical heartbeat unlike anything in the galaxy he called home. He reached into the Force, drawing on it the way a man draws breath, and found it, thin, distant, like a fire seen across a vast frozen plain. Present, but reduced. He said nothing yet. He simply listened. Obi-Wan Kenobi straightened beside him, one hand instinctively moving toward the lightsaber at his belt. The corridor's sterile lighting cast sharp shadows across the Jedi Master's bearded face. His eyes carried that characteristic quality. Alert, measured, the gaze of a man who had walked into impossible situations so many times that impossibility itself had become merely another variable to assess. He reached out with the Force as well and felt the same diminishment Yoda had noticed. Not gone. Not severed. But muffled, as though the universe itself were wrapped in something that dampened its resonance. Different, this place feels, Yoda said quietly, his ears tilting forward. Profoundly, Obi-Wan agreed. But we're alive. And wherever we are, the Force is still with us. The ship's internal sensors found them 11 seconds later. Red alert klaxons painted the corridor in urgent crimson. 4 security officers materialized at the corridor's far end, not transported, Obi-Wan noted, but arriving through sliding doors at remarkable speed, carrying weapons neither Jedi recognized. The officers moved with trained efficiency, their posture defensive but not immediately aggressive. The lead officer, a tall human woman with close-cropped hair and lieutenant's pips, raised her weapon and spoke with the careful authority of someone following protocol while clearly operating outside of it. Unauthorized personnel. You will come with us to the bridge. Any resistance will be met with force. Obi-Wan raised both hands slowly, the universal gesture of non-aggression. We have no intention of resisting. We are travelers. Lost ones, I'm afraid. He offered a calm, slightly rueful smile. We'd very much appreciate speaking with whoever is in command. The lieutenant's eyes moved to Yoda, and whatever composure she had maintained briefly flickered. She had been trained for first contact scenarios. She had studied xenobiology and diplomatic protocols at the academy. She had not, in any simulation or briefing, encountered a being who stood 60 centimeters tall, carried a small cane, had ears that moved independently, and radiated the quiet authority of something genuinely ancient. Both of you, she managed. Bridge. Now. Captain Picard was already standing when the turbolift doors opened. He had reviewed the sensor footage twice in the 60 seconds it took to escort the strangers from Deck 6. Data stood at his station with the focused stillness he adopted when confronted with a genuinely novel problem. Counselor Troi had risen from her chair without entirely meaning to, drawn to her feet by something she could not yet name. A presence, vast and layered and old, emanating from the smaller of the two figures like heat from a star. Picard clasped his hands behind his back and regarded the two robed men with the careful respect he extended to every unknown. His eyes moved from the tall, bearded human, or near human, to the small green being with ancient eyes. He drew a measured breath. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. You are aboard a vessel of the United Federation of Planets. A pause. I'd very much like to know who you are, and how you came to be on my ship. Obi-Wan met the captain's gaze with one equally steady. My name is Obi-Wan Kenobi. My companion is Master Yoda. We are Jedi, guardians of peace from a galaxy I suspect is very far from your own. He glanced briefly at the vast starfield beyond the viewscreen, at constellations that matched nothing in his memory. We mean you no harm, Captain. We are as puzzled by our arrival as you are. Troi touched Picard's arm lightly, drawing his attention with a glance. Her expression was not alarmed. It was something rarer, wonder. They're telling the truth, she said softly. Whatever they are, Captain, I've never felt anything like them. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. Picard had learned, across decades of command, that the most dangerous assumption a captain could make was to believe he understood what he was looking at. The two men standing in the center of his bridge were proof of that principle made flesh. Everything about them suggested familiarity. One appeared human in every measurable sense, calm and articulate, with the bearing of a diplomat or a scholar. The other was clearly non-human, yet radiated something that Picard's instincts, honed by years of first contact, recognized as profound intelligence and authority. And yet his sensors told him almost nothing useful. Whatever they were, they existed at the edges of everything Starfleet science could measure. Mr. Data, Picard said, keeping his voice level, what can you tell me? Data's fingers moved across his console with characteristic precision. Both individuals register as biological life forms, Captain. The taller subject appears largely humanoid, with minor cellular variations I have not yet classified. The smaller subject is more unusual, his species is entirely unknown to Federation records. However, what is most remarkable is not their biology. A brief pause, which on Data functioned as the equivalent of a dramatic breath. Both individuals emit a continuous low-frequency energy field. It does not correspond to any known form of radiation, electromagnetic phenomenon, or subspace variance. It is, by every measurable standard, something we have no category for. Could it be dangerous? Worf asked from tactical, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who preferred clear answers to comfortable ambiguities. Unknown, Lieutenant, Data replied. There is no indication of weaponized intent in the field's properties. It appears to be organic. Naturally occurring within their physiology. Obi-Wan listened to this exchange with quiet attention. He had been assessed before, by Senate committees, by separatist intelligence, by beings of considerable power. Being discussed as a sensor anomaly was a new experience, but not an unwelcome one. It told him a great deal about this civilization. They were systematic. Empirical. They reached for instruments before conclusions. He respected that instinct, even if he knew it would find him difficult to explain. Yoda, for his part, had moved slowly to the viewscreen and stood gazing at the stars beyond the glass with his hands folded over his cane. He was doing what he always did in unfamiliar situations, listening to the Force, however quiet it had become here, reading the emotional landscape of the room the way a musician reads a score. The counselor, Troy, the captain had called her, was watching him with undisguised fascination. He could feel her sensitivity. Not force sensitivity, precisely, but something adjacent. An openness. An awareness of others that reminded him, faintly, of a Betazoid healer he had never met but somehow recognized in her. "You feel it too," he said, without turning from the view screen. Troy blinked. "I'm sorry." The currents. Between people. He glanced back at her, one ear tilting slightly. "Different, your gift is. Similar in shape, Troy looked at Picard, who gave her the microscopic nod that meant proceed with caution and report everything. She stepped closer to the small green being, drawn by professional curiosity and something less easily categorized. "I'm an empath," she said carefully. "I sense the emotions of others. It's a Betazoid ability, my mother's species." "Sense emotions," Yoda repeated, tasting the words. "But deeper than emotions, have you looked?" She had no immediate answer for that, which seemed to satisfy him. Picard gestured toward the observation lounge, the glass-walled room adjacent to the bridge where difficult conversations were best held away from the operational hum of duty stations. "Gentlemen, I'd like to continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable. I have questions, and I suspect you do as well." "Many questions, yes," Yoda agreed, turning from the view screen. "Answers, fewer. But willing to try, we are." Seated around the long table, with the starfield scrolling slowly past the windows, Picard listened as Obi-Wan laid out their situation with admirable economy. They came from another galaxy, or perhaps another dimension entirely, Obi-Wan acknowledged, the distinction being one he was not certain even his own scientists could resolve. Their civilization was ancient, spanning thousands of star systems, governed by a republic now transformed into an empire. The Jedi were its former guardians, an order of individuals attuned to an energy field called the Force, which bound all living things and could be channeled by those with the sensitivity to perceive it. Picard absorbed this with the expression he wore when processing genuinely new information, a slight narrowing of the eyes, a stillness in his posture. "The Force," he said. "This energy field data detected." "The same," Obi-Wan confirmed. "And it connects all living things." "In our universe, yes." Here, Obi-Wan paused, choosing honesty over reassurance. "It's present. But diminished. As though this universe has the same underlying fabric, but the threads are more loosely woven where the Force is concerned." Data had brought a tricorder. He had been scanning continuously since they sat down, with the polite persistence of someone who genuinely could not help himself. "Fascinating. The energy field does appear to fluctuate in response to emotional states. When Master Yoda spoke just now, the field's intensity increased by approximately 12%. Yoda looked at the tricorder. Then at Data. Then, with the slow deliberateness of the very old and very wise, he reached out one small hand and lifted the tricorder 6 inches off the table without touching it. Worf's hand went to his comm badge instantly. Data stared at his now floating instrument with an expression that, on a human face, would have been called delight. "Remarkable," he said. "A telekinetic manipulation of matter with no mechanical interface whatsoever. Captain, I believe I need a considerably more sophisticated sensor array." Picard looked at the floating tricorder. Then at Yoda. Then, very deliberately, he folded his hands on the table. "Indeed," he said. "Gentlemen, I believe this conversation has only just begun." Dr. Beverly Crusher had seen a great many things in her years aboard the Enterprise-D. She had treated Klingon, Romulans, Betazoids, Bolians, and beings whose biology had no precedent in Federation medical literature. She had once treated a being of pure energy who had temporarily inhabited a crew member's body. She believed, with the confidence of someone who had been tested repeatedly on the matter, that she was not easily surprised. Yoda proved her wrong within 40 seconds of entering sickbay. His cellular structure was unlike anything in her database. The midichlorian count, a term neither Jedi had used but which Crusher had arrived at independently when her instruments detected unusual concentrations of microorganisms within every cell of both men's bodies, was off every scale she possessed. These organisms were not parasitic. They were not viral. They appeared to be symbiotic at a level so fundamental that separating them from their hosts would be the biological equivalent of removing someone's nervous system. They were, as best she could determine, the physical substrate of what Obi-Wan called the Force. "They're not just in your cells," she said, studying her display with focused bewilderment. "They're generating something. A field. Continuously." "The Force," Obi-Wan said from the biobed, with the patience of a man who had explained this concept many times to people who found it difficult. "It flows through us. We don't generate it, we channel it. The distinction matters." To a biologist, Crusher said, "It matters considerably less than you might think." She glanced at Yoda, who was sitting on the adjacent bio-bed with his feet dangling well above the floor, watching her instruments with serene curiosity. "Your readings are even more pronounced. The concentration in your tissue is," she paused. "How old are you, Master Yoda?" 900 years, he said pleasantly. "Give or take a decade, Crusher set her tricorder down. "Just for a moment." Then she picked it up again. "Right," she said. It was Lieutenant Commander Data who introduced the first real friction of the day, and he did so, as was his custom, with complete innocence and zero diplomatic instinct. He arrived in sickbay with Ensign T'Pel, one of the Enterprise's 2 Vulcan science officers, to conduct what he had described in his request to Picard as a comparative metaphysical analysis. T'Pel was young by Vulcan standards, perhaps 110. With the composed, faintly skeptical expression her species deployed as a default setting. Obi-Wan had encountered Vulcans before in the sense that he had encountered no Vulcans, this being his first hour in a new universe. But he recognized the archetype immediately, the deliberate stillness, the precise speech, the careful subordination of feeling to reason. He had trained younglings with similar instincts. He had also, over the years, learned that beings who prided themselves on pure logic were sometimes the most brittle when logic proved insufficient. T'Pel studied Obi-Wan with clinical detachment. "You claim the ability to influence the cognition of other beings through what you term a mind trick," she said. "A manipulation of perception and volition through this so-called force field." "In my home universe, yes," Obi-Wan said carefully. "Here the force is diminished. I wouldn't presume to." "I am willing to serve as a test subject," T'Pel said. "In the interest of scientific documentation." Data looked up from his instruments with something approaching eagerness. Crusher took a small, unconscious step backward. Obi-Wan looked at Yoda. Yoda's expression was unreadable, which in 900 years of practice had come to mean this will be instructive, and not necessarily in the way anyone expects. Obi-Wan turned to T'Pel and reached carefully into the Force, that thin, cold stream of it available to him here, and spoke with the gentle authority he had used 1,000 times. "You should sit down and rest." Nothing happened. T'Pel raised one elegant eyebrow. The attempt was perceptible as a mild external pressure on my cognitive field. My Vulcan mental disciplines, developed over decades of rigorous training, appear to be entirely sufficient to resist it. A pause that contained, if one listened carefully, the faintest note of satisfaction. Fascinating that your technique relies on a susceptibility that disciplined minds can overcome. Obi-Wan absorbed this with genuine thoughtfulness rather than wounded pride. "You're right," he said, and meant it. "The technique works by finding the path of least resistance in an unguarded mind." "A disciplined mind," he nodded slowly. "I've encountered similar resistance before. Force users with strong mental walls. Beings of exceptional will. But never quite so," he searched for the word. "Logical?" T'Pel offered. Architectural, Obi-Wan said. Your mental structure isn't just guarded. It's organized. There's almost no emotional current for the suggestion to ride on. He looked genuinely impressed. Remarkable. T'Pel considered this. Your technique exploits emotional cognition as a vector. Essentially, yes. Then it would be ineffective against any sufficiently disciplined Vulcan mind. In this universe, apparently so. Obi-Wan glanced at Yoda again. Which raises an interesting question about what the Force actually is here. In our galaxy, it transcends individual will. Here, it seems to operate more like suggestion, data supplied helpfully. Enhanced by the subject's receptivity and the practitioner's skill. Analogous, perhaps, to advanced empathic projection. Yoda had been silent through this exchange, eyes half closed. Now he spoke. Wrong, not entirely. But incomplete, yes. He opened his eyes fully and looked at T'Pel with an expression that was warm without being presumptuous. Show you something, may I? Harm nothing, it will. T'Pel gave the Vulcan equivalent of a shrug, which was a single, almost imperceptible nod. Yoda closed his eyes. The room changed, not physically, not in any way Data's instruments fully captured, though they spiked across 3 different readings simultaneously. It was subtler than that. The air felt different. The background hum of the ship seemed to recede. And in the silence that opened up, every person in sickbay felt, briefly and unmistakably, the presence of something vast and patient and extraordinarily alive. Not threatening, not invasive, simply there, the way gravity is there, the way time is there, present in everything and noticed only when someone draws your attention to it. T'Pel stood very still for 4 full seconds. Then she said, with careful Vulcan precision, I will need to meditate on this. Yoda opened his eyes. Yes, he said gently. Most do. The Romulan warbird Valdor's shadow had been running silent for 6 days on the Federation side of the neutral zone, which was either a significant diplomatic incident or standard operating procedure depending on which side of the border you asked. Commander Torith was not a woman who concerned herself with such distinctions. She was Tal Shiar, which meant she operated in the space between legality and necessity where most Romulan officers feared to tread, and she had been monitoring the Enterprise-D's communications with the clinical patience of someone who had learned that the most valuable intelligence rarely announced itself. The anomaly had announced itself anyway. Her science officer had flagged the subspace rift within seconds of its formation. An energy signature that matched nothing in the Tal Shiar's considerable archives, which stretched back through centuries of intelligence gathering across 2 quadrants. The rift's collapse had been followed by a cascade of unusual readings from the Enterprise, bio-signs that defied classification, energy fields with no known source, and, most intriguingly, a complete cessation of the Federation vessel's standard survey operations. The Enterprise had stopped moving. It was holding position in the Devron system and conducting what appeared to be intensive internal sensor sweeps. Something had come through that rift. Something the Federation was now studying with great urgency. Torith leaned back in her command chair and considered her options with the methodical calm that had made her one of the Tal Shiar's most effective field commanders. She opened a channel to her intelligence analyst. What do we know about the 2 life signs? Unknown species for 1, Commander. The other registers as humanoid but with cellular anomalies our instruments cannot categorize. Both emit a continuous energy field we've never encountered. Whatever they are, a pause. They are not from this quadrant. Possibly not from this galaxy. And Starfleet's response? No distress signals. No requests for backup. Picard appears to be handling this internally. Another pause. He's keeping them aboard voluntarily, Commander. There's been no attempt at containment beyond standard security protocols. Torith allowed herself a small, cold smile. Picard's instinct for diplomacy was well documented and, from a tactical standpoint, consistently exploitable. The captain would extend trust, ask careful questions, offer Earl Grey tea, and generally treat beings of unknown power as honored guests until proven otherwise. It was, she supposed, an admirable philosophy. It was also, from where she was sitting, an opportunity. She had no intention of opening fire on the Enterprise. That would be clumsy, and clumsiness was not a Tal Shiar virtue. What she needed was access. And access, in her experience, was best obtained through intermediaries. Her opportunity arrived in the form of a Ferengi trading vessel, the Profit Margin, registered out of Dopteria, currently operating legally in the Devron system under a standard Federation commercial transit permit. Its captain, a thoroughly unscrupulous individual named Bakrao, had on 3 previous occasions provided the Tal Shiar with information in exchange for considerations he preferred not to have itemized in any official record. Toreth composed a tight beam transmission on a frequency the Federation wouldn't recognize as communications traffic, and waited. Aboard the Enterprise, the Jedi were unaware of the attention gathering beyond the ship's sensor range. They were occupied with something more immediately demanding. A conversation with Picard in the observation lounge that had been running for 2 hours and showed no sign of reaching a natural conclusion, largely because every answer either Jedi provided generated 4 new questions that Picard considered too important to defer. It was Obi-Wan who first raised the subject that changed the conversation's texture. Entirely. "Captain," he said, setting down the cup of tea he had accepted with genuine appreciation, "you've been extraordinarily patient with our situation. I'd like to extend the same courtesy to yours. You're holding position near what I understand to be a contested border. Our arrival has complicated your mission. What aren't you telling us?" Picard regarded him for a moment with the expression he wore when someone had correctly read him. Then he made the decision, visible in the slight shift of his posture, to be direct. 3 days ago, before the anomaly appeared, we received intelligence suggesting unusual Romulan activity in this sector. We were here to observe and document. He paused. Your arrival has made this ship considerably more interesting to parties who were already watching. The Romulans, Obi-Wan said. Almost certainly. Yoda, who had been sitting quietly with his eyes closed for the past 20 minutes in what Picard had initially mistaken for sleep and had gradually come to understand was something else entirely, opened his eyes. Watching us now, someone is, he said. Close. Patient. Hungry for what we represent. Picard's combadge chirped before he could respond. Bridge to Captain Picard. We're picking up a Ferengi vessel on an intercept course. They're hailing us, sir. They say they have cargo for trade, but their approach vector is odd. They came from the direction of the neutral zone. Picard stood. On my way. He looked at the 2 Jedi. I'd ask you to remain here, but I suspect that request would be ignored. Yes, Yoda said pleasantly, already sliding off his chair. On the bridge, the Ferengi captain's face filled the view screen with the particular combination of greed and false friendliness that was the species' diplomatic default. Bakrao was all teeth and gestures, offering medical supplies at competitive rates, asking nothing in return except a brief docking permission, purely for efficiency, he insisted, purely for the convenience of direct transfer. Obi-Wan stood slightly behind Picard's left shoulder and studied the Ferengi with calm attention. He reached into the Force, thin as it was, and felt the shape of the transmission beneath the transmission. The fear underneath the performance. The other voice, behind Bakrao's voice, giving instructions through a hidden earpiece. He's not alone in this, Obi-Wan said quietly, for Picard's ears only. Someone is directing him. Someone watching from a distance who wants to know if we'll lower our guard. Picard gave the smallest of nods. Then he addressed the view screen with the gracious firmness he had perfected over 30 years. Thank you for your offer, Captain Bakrao. We have no need of supplies at this time. Safe travels. He cut the channel and turned to Worf. Yellow alert. And keep a very close eye on the neutral zone. Yoda watched the Ferengi vessel change course on the view screen and felt the presence beyond it, calculated, cold, and intensely interested. He said nothing yet. But his ears had tilted forward in the way Obi-Wan had learned, across many years, to recognize as a warning. Something was coming. And it had already decided what it wanted. Worf had opinions about the two robed strangers, and he had been keeping them at a disciplined remove from his professional conduct, which was itself a form of respect he extended to very few people he had known for less than a day. The smaller one, Yoda, moved through the ship with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never in 900 years needed to prove anything to anyone, which Worf found simultaneously irritating and deeply compelling. The taller one, Kenobi, had the bearing of a warrior who had learned to disguise himself as a diplomat, which was a quality Worf understood better than most. It was Worf who suggested the holodeck. Not out of hospitality, he left that to Counselor Troi and the captain, but out of a need that was both professional and personal. He needed to understand what these beings could do. Starfleet security protocols required threat assessment of all unknown entities aboard the ship, and Worf took his protocols seriously. But underneath that justification, running parallel to it like a secondary power conduit, was something simpler and more honest. He wanted to know if they could fight. He framed the request to Picard as a security evaluation. Picard, who understood Worf perhaps better than Worf understood himself, approved it with the mild expression of someone who knew exactly what was actually being asked and had decided it was probably useful anyway. The holodeck was configured to a neutral training environment, a flat gray space with variable gravity settings and enough room to move. Worf arrived in his Starfleet uniform with a bat'leth under his arm, which was not standard security assessment equipment and which he had brought anyway. Obi-Wan arrived in his robes with his hands loose at his sides and the particular quality of relaxed attention that Worf had begun to identify as the Jedi's version of combat readiness. Yoda arrived with his cane and sat on a holographic rock to observe, which told Worf more than anything else that had happened since their arrival. "I want to understand your capabilities," Worf said, dispensing with preamble in the way that Klingon considered respectful and most other species experienced as abrupt. "Not to threaten you. To know what stands beside me if a threat arrives." Obi-Wan studied the bat'leth with genuine interest. "A honorable weapon. Designed for a two-handed grip but adaptable. The curved blade allows for both offensive sweeps and defensive redirections." He paused. "You've been trained in it since childhood." Worf stiffened slightly. "How did you know that?" "The way you hold it. Not like a tool. Like an extension." Obi-Wan's hand moved to his lightsaber hilt. "May I?" What followed was not a fight in any conventional sense. It was something closer to a conversation conducted in movement. Worf pressing forward with the powerful, aggressive style of Klingon martial tradition, and Obi-Wan answering each attack with a fluid economy that deflected rather than blocked, redirected rather than resisted. The lightsaber's blue blade, brilliant even in the holodeck's artificial light, moved in arcs that seemed almost leisurely until you tried to follow them precisely, at which point they became something the eye could track but the body couldn't predict. 3 times Worf committed to a full offensive sequence. 3 times he found himself facing empty space where Obi-Wan had been, the Jedi having moved not away but around, occupying angles that Worf's training hadn't suggested as options. He was not being outmatched in strength. He was being outthought in geometry. After the 3rd sequence, Worf stopped. He was breathing harder than he would have preferred. Obi-Wan was breathing normally, which was also something Worf noted. "You don't fight to win," Worf said. "I fight to end conflict," Obi-Wan said. "Which occasionally looks like winning." Worf considered this for a long moment. Then, with the gravity of someone making a formal declaration, he said, "You are a warrior. Whatever else you are." "I was trained to be a peacekeeper," Obi-Wan said. "Which required being a warrior first." He deactivated his lightsaber. "In my experience, the distinction matters enormously. From his rock, Yoda made a small sound that might have been approval. It was Worf who then said, with the careful formality of someone crossing a bridge they had been standing near for some time. In Klingon culture, those who fight alongside you are accorded a status. Not friendship exactly. Something older. He met Obi-Wan's eyes. You would be called so-hvad. One whose blade I would not question at my back. Obi-Wan inclined his head. I'm honored. Worf turned to Yoda, who had not moved from his rock and had given no indication of intending to. And you, Master Yoda. You carry a weapon. But you haven't offered to demonstrate it. Yoda's ears rose slightly. His ancient eyes contained something that was not quite amusement but occupied the same neighborhood. Demonstrate for you, I could, he said. But unnecessary, that would be. Already assessed me, you have. Decided already, your instincts have. Worf stared at him. What have my instincts decided? That the one to worry about, Yoda said serenely, am I. The silence that followed was the particular kind that occurs when someone has said something so precisely true that arguing with it would be embarrassing. Worf looked at the small ancient being on the holographic rock, at the Jimmer stick resting across his knees, at the eyes that had seen 9 centuries of conflict and carried none of its bitterness. Then Worf did something almost no one had seen him do in a professional context. He laughed. Short, genuine, the laugh of a warrior who has met something worthy of recognition. He pressed his right fist to his chest in the Klingon gesture of respect offered to equals. Yoda returned the gesture with a small nod that carried, somehow, the weight of an entire tradition. Behind it. The holodeck session ended without formal conclusion, which was itself a conclusion. Walking back through the corridor toward the bridge, Obi-Wan fell into step beside Worf and they moved in the easy silence of people who have established, without needing to discuss it, where they stand with each other. Neither of them noticed the slight fluctuation in the ship's sensor grid. A microsecond gap in the Enterprise's long-range sweeps, precisely timed to allow a small probe, launched from the now distant Ferengi vessel, to slip inside the ship's sensor shadow and begin transmitting. Someone was listening very carefully now. And they had heard enough to make their next move. He appeared on the bridge between one moment and the next, which was his preferred method of arrival, not because transportation was difficult for him, but because the moment of appearing was itself a statement. One instant the command chair area was occupied only by Picard and his senior staff. The next, a figure in a Starfleet uniform that somehow managed to look simultaneously authentic and faintly satirical was leaning against the con station with his arms folded and the expression of a man who has arrived at a party he himself organized and is already finding it beneath his expectations. Q, Picard said, with the tone of someone who has long since moved past surprise into a kind of weary familiarity. Mon Capitaine. Q straightened and spread his arms in a gesture of theatrical welcome. Don't you look capable and determined as always? His eyes moved immediately past Picard, past Riker, past the entire senior staff, and fixed on the 2 robed figures standing near the view screen with the focused attention of someone who has walked into a room and found the one thing in it that genuinely interests him. Oh, he said. And then, more quietly, with something underneath the performance that was almost. Not quite, but almost, genuine, oh, my. He crossed the bridge toward Yoda and Obi-Wan with the particular gait of someone pretending to stroll while actually moving with great purpose. He stopped 3 meters away and studied them with the intensity of a collector who has discovered something he didn't know existed and is now recalculating the value of his entire collection. You're not from here, he said. Observed, already that has been, Yoda said pleasantly. Q's eyes narrowed. Not with hostility, with the specific expression of a being accustomed to being the most unusual presence in any room finding himself, for the first time in recent memory, uncertain of his own ranking. You're not from anywhere I know, he said. And I know everywhere. He turned to Picard with something that in a lesser being would have been called excitement. Picard. Do you have any idea what these 2 are? We've been working on that question since this morning, Picard said carefully. They carry something, Q said, turning back to the Jedi. Something that exists in your universe at a concentration that makes this one look, he searched for the word. Anemic. You're walking around in a dimmer version of your own reality and you're still functioning. That's either extraordinary adaptation or extraordinary stubbornness. Both, in our experience, Obi-Wan said. Q smiled, the real one, not the performance. It lasted approximately 1 second before the performance reasserted itself. He began to circle them slowly, and the bridge crew watched with the tense attention of people observing an unpredictable phenomenon near something valuable and irreplaceable. The little one is older than most civilizations in this quadrant, Q said, gesturing at Yoda with affected casualness. And the tall one, he paused near Obi-Wan. You've died before. The bridge went very quiet. Obi-Wan met Q's gaze without flinching. Yes. And came back. Not through technology. Not through temporal mechanics. Q tilted his head. Through that thing you carry. The Force, Obi-Wan said. Those who are deeply enough connected to it can persist beyond physical death. As energy. As presence. Q was silent for a full 3 seconds, which was, for Q, essentially an eternity. The continuum has no record of this mechanism, he said finally. We've observed every form of consciousness persistence across 11 dimensions. We've catalogued 312 distinct methods of achieving what you'd call immortality. He looked at Obi-Wan with an expression that was, beneath all its layers of performance and condescension, something very close to unsettled. Yours isn't on the list. Perhaps, Obi-Wan said gently, your list is incomplete. Q turned away sharply. Which was the closest he came to acknowledging a point he didn't like. He moved to the center of the bridge and addressed the room with recovered grandeur. Well. This is considerably more interesting than I expected, and I expected it to be very interesting indeed, which is why I arranged it. You arranged this? Picard said, with the controlled patience of someone resisting a much stronger response. The rift, yes. Technically. Q examined his fingernails. I've been watching these two for some time. From a distance, you understand, their universe has certain properties that make extended observation somewhat uncomfortable for beings of my nature. All that, he gestured vaguely. Density. Of the Force. It's rather loud, dimensionally speaking. He looked at Yoda. You, in particular, are very loud. Apologize, I do not, Yoda said. No, I don't suppose you would. Q studied him for another moment. 900 years old, and in all that time you've never encountered anything like the continuum. Yet you're not afraid of me. He made this sound like an accusation. Why aren't you afraid of me? Yoda considered the question with genuine seriousness, which was clearly not the response Q had anticipated. Afraid of power, I have never been, he said finally. Only of what power does to those who forget why they carry it. He looked at Q with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who has seen genuine darkness and is therefore not particularly impressed by theatrical omnipotence. Lonely, you are. For all your power. Lonely and bored and looking, always, for something that surprises you. A pause. Found it, have you? Question is what you do with it. Q stared at him. Picard watched Q stare at Yoda and recognized, with the instinct of someone who had been Q's primary subject for years, that something genuinely unusual was happening. Q was not performing. The mask was still there, but behind it, something had shifted. He had been read, not by a superior intelligence, not by a more powerful being, but by wisdom. And wisdom, Picard suspected, was something Q encountered considerably less often than he encountered power. I could send you home, Q said abruptly, to both Jedi. Right now. Snap my fingers. Your galaxy, your timeline, your war. His eyes moved between them. Why haven't you asked me to? It was Obi-Wan who answered, and his answer was quiet and carried no drama whatsoever. Because we don't think we're finished here yet. Q looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Yoda. Then he looked at Picard with an expression that was, for the first time in their long and complicated acquaintance, something approaching respect extended to a situation rather than performed for an audience. No, Q said softly. Neither do I. He didn't vanish. He stayed. And in staying, changed the shape of everything that followed. The Borg cube dropped out of transwarp on the edge of the Devron system at 0347 ship's time, and the Enterprise's red alert klaxons dragged the crew from sleep into crisis with the brutal efficiency that Starfleet training was designed to produce. Picard was on the bridge in 40 seconds, still fastening his uniform, his face carrying the particular controlled gravity he reserved for threats that required absolute clarity of command. He had faced the Borg before in ways that most Starfleet officers had not, from inside the collective, wearing their technology, speaking their language. That experience had left marks that didn't show on scans but shaped every decision he made when that distinctive geometric shape appeared on his view screen. The cube was massive. They always were. It filled the screen with the impassive certainty of something that did not consider itself to be in a confrontation so much as a process. Shields up, arm photon torpedoes, Picard said. Open a channel. The Borg didn't wait for the channel. They never did. The universal translator rendered their transmission into the flat, layered harmony of the collective's voice, thousands of minds speaking as one, each word carrying the weight of irreversible intention. We are the Borg. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile. Standard greeting, Riker said from his right, with the dark humor of someone who had learned to find small comforts in familiar awfulness. What was not standard, what caused Data to look up from his console with the focused expression he adopted when his processing encountered something genuinely novel, was the addendum that followed the standard message, transmitted on a secondary frequency half a second later. The two unknown organisms aboard the Federation vessel will be assimilated first. Their biological distinctiveness is without precedent. Assimilation will be prioritized. Obi-Wan and Yoda had arrived on the bridge during the transmission, drawn by the red alert and the felt disturbance. Even through the Force's diminished state in this universe, the Borg's collective consciousness registered as something deeply and fundamentally wrong. Not evil in any simple sense. Something colder than evil. A vast negation of the individual, a hunger so systematic it had ceased to be hunger and become simply the collective's nature, the way a black hole's nature is to consume. Yoda stood very still near the view screen and felt the shape of it. Thousands of minds pressed into service, their individual currents flattened into a single relentless flow. He had felt the dark side of the Force in many forms across 9 centuries. He had felt the cold emptiness of those who had surrendered their identity to pure power. The Borg was something different, not dark side, not corruption of the Force, but a kind of spiritual silence that was in its own way more disturbing. Where dark side users burned with terrible purpose, the Borg simply erased. There was no passion to engage. No fear to address. Only process. Cannot reach them, he said quietly, to Obi-Wan alone. No individual minds to find. Only the current of the whole. Obi-Wan nodded. He had already attempted it, reached into the Force and tried to find a single consciousness within the cube's crew to touch, to create the moment of hesitation that Jedi negotiation required. There was nothing. Or rather, there was something vast and undifferentiated, like trying to have a conversation with an ocean. The first cutting beam struck the Enterprise's shields at 0349, and the bridge lurched with the impact. Worf returned fire immediately, a spread of photon torpedoes that struck the cube and achieved the damage assessment that every Starfleet officer who had faced the Borg expected and dreaded. Minimal. The collective adapted to the torpedo frequency in seconds. They're adapting shield frequencies, Data reported. At their current rate of adaptation, our weapons will be fully ineffective in approximately 4 minutes. Suggestions? Picard said, with the clipped authority of someone who already knew the standard options were insufficient and was specifically asking for something beyond them. It was Obi-Wan who spoke. The cutting beam, it's a focused energy weapon. Consistent frequency, consistent modulation. In my universe, a lightsaber works by containing a plasma blade within a force-attuned kyber crystal. The crystal naturally interacts with energy fields. He looked at Picard. If I position myself at the point of beam impact on your shields and attempt to interact with the beam directly, redirect it rather than absorb it. That would require you to be outside the ship's shields, Riker said flatly. Or at the shield boundary, Obi-Wan corrected. In a section of the ship where the shield emitters are accessible and I can work directly with the energy as it strikes. The deflector control room, Data said immediately. Deck 32. The secondary shield emitters run through the port bulkhead. If the beam strikes that section, he calculated for 2 seconds. There is a 17% probability this approach produces a result. However, the probability of personal harm to 17% is better than 0, Obi-Wan said. While Obi-Wan moved toward the turbolift with Worf as an escort, Yoda remained on the bridge and turned his attention to the problem from a different angle entirely. He closed his eyes amid the noise and urgency of Red Alert and reached into the Force with a focus that set Troy's empathic senses firing across every frequency she possessed. He was not reaching for the Borg cube. He was reaching beneath it, or rather, through it. Searching for the one element of the collective that the hive mind had not yet fully absorbed. The drones had been individuals once. Humans, Klingon. Species from across 2 quadrants, each one carrying the residual imprint of a self that assimilation had buried but not entirely destroyed. The Borg suppressed individuality. They did not, Yoda now understood, eliminate it completely. A self, once formed, left a mark in the Force that persisted even under the collective's weight, faint, compressed, like light under deep water. He found one. A human. Recently assimilated, weeks, perhaps. The self still close enough to the surface to be touched. He did not try to liberate it. That was beyond him here, with the Force this thin. But he held that small compressed light in his attention and poured into it the one thing the collective could not synthesize or assimilate, simple, uncomplicated compassion. Not as a weapon. Not as a tactic. As a fact. You were someone. You are still, somewhere, someone. The cube's cutting beam flickered. It lasted only a fraction of a second. A microsecond hesitation in the collective's coordination, a ripple crossing the surface of the hive mind from an inexplicable source. Data registered it as an anomalous power fluctuation in the cube's weapons array. Picard registered it as something he could use. All power to engines, evasive pattern Delta 4, he ordered instantly. Move us out of beam range. The Enterprise surged forward and the cutting beam swept empty space where they had been. In deflector control, Obi-Wan felt the ship move beneath him and adjusted his position against the bulkhead, lightsaber activated, waiting for the next strike with the focused calm of someone who had learned that patience and timing were more reliable than speed. Above them, the Borg cube paused. And in the collective's vast distributed consciousness, something small and inexplicable was asking a question that had no place in any assimilation protocol. The Borg cube's hesitation lasted 11 seconds by Data's count, which was 11 seconds longer than any hesitation the collective had demonstrated in every prior engagement in Starfleet's records. Picard used every one of them. The Enterprise pulled to maximum impulse, creating distance while Worf recalibrated torpedo frequencies on a rotating modulation cycle that would buy minutes rather than hours before adaptation but minutes, in a fight with the Borg, were the difference between a log entry and a memorial service. In deflector control, Obi-Wan braced against the port bulkhead as the ship accelerated and felt the shift in the engagement through the soles of his boots and the thin current of the Force simultaneously. The Borg had paused. Something had distracted them. He didn't know what. He could feel Yoda's presence at the edge of his awareness, concentrated and purposeful in that distinctive way that meant the Grand Master was doing something that looked like nothing while being everything. But the pause was real and he intended to use it. Kenobi to bridge, he said into his comm badge, the device having been recalibrated to his voice pattern by a very focused Geordi LaForge 20 minutes after their arrival. What's our status? Buying time, Worf's voice answered, which told Obi-Wan the situation was serious enough that Worf had abandoned diplomatic framing entirely. The cube is recalibrating. We have perhaps 6 minutes before they resume full offensive operations. 6 minutes. Obi-Wan looked at the deflector control interface, a complex arrangement of panels and conduits that Geordi had walked him through at remarkable speed, the chief engineer possessing the rare gift of being able to explain sophisticated technology to someone with no technological frame of reference whatsoever by simply showing rather than describing. The secondary shield emitters ran through 3 conduits behind the port bulkhead. The Borg cutting beam, when it came, would target the area of weakest shield coherence, and in the Enterprise's current configuration, after absorbing 2 glancing strikes, that was precisely here. What Obi-Wan was attempting had no precedent in either of their respective universes. In his own galaxy, Kyber crystals, the focusing elements at the heart of every lightsaber, were force-attuned objects. They resonated with the Force the way certain minerals resonated with specific frequencies of light. The crystal in his lightsaber had been his since his Padawan years, shaped by decades of use into something that was partially technology and partially an extension of himself. Here, where the Force was thin, that attunement was diminished but present, the crystal still responded, still channeled what Force existed in this universe, still operated as a bridge between his intention and the physical world. The Borg cutting beam was a focused energy weapon of extraordinary precision. It operated on frequencies that Federation shields were designed to resist but not redirect. What Obi-Wan was proposing, what he was not entirely certain was possible, was to use his lightsaber as an intermediary. Not to block the beam, which would overwhelm even a lightsaber's containment field at Borg power levels. But to touch it at the moment of shield impact and introduce a directional variance. A nudge. The Force guiding not a mind but a stream of energy. It was, he acknowledged to himself in the 30 seconds he had to think about it, not the most carefully considered plan he had ever executed. It was, however, the one available. On the bridge, the Borg cube completed its recalibration and began its approach vector. Data tracked it with the focused attention of someone running 17 simultaneous calculations and finding all of them producing answers he didn't like. Captain, the cube is targeting deflector control specifically. They appear to have identified it as a point of tactical interest. They've been watching us, Riker said. Continuously, yes. The collective processes tactical data in real time across the entire cube's sensor array. They have identified the shield weakness and are targeting it deliberately. Data paused. They may also have identified Obi-Wan's presence in that section. Picard's jaw tightened. Hail them. The collective's response was immediate and unchanged. Resistance was futile. Assimilation was inevitable. The 2 unknown organisms would be added to their biological distinctiveness. The transmission carried no negotiating position because the Borg had no concept of negotiation. They were not being aggressive in any emotional sense. They were simply continuing a process. Yoda listened to the transmission from his position near Troy's station and felt, beneath the collective's flat certainty, the compressed human light he had found earlier. Still there. Dimmer now. The collective pressing down on it harder in response to whatever disturbance his earlier contact had caused, the hive mind tightening its suppression like an immune response to an irritant. But present. Still present. He reached into the Force again, deeper this time, accepting the cost of it. He could feel the drain more acutely now, the force in this universe insufficient to sustain the kind of extended deep contact he was accustomed to, each reach into it leaving him slightly more depleted than the last. He was 900 years old and had reserves that would have staggered a younger Jedi, but he was not unlimited. Not here. He chose to spend what he had. He found the light again and this time did not simply hold it. He pulled. Gently, carefully, the way you coax a frightened creature from shelter, not commanding, not forcing, simply making the direction of safety clear. Here. This way. For just a moment. The drone 3 decks into the Borg cube designated for weapons targeting experienced something the collective had no classification for. A memory, specific, sensory. Overwhelming in its completeness. A kitchen on Earth. Morning light through a window. The smell of coffee. A child's voice calling from another room. It lasted 0.003 seconds by any external measure and approximately forever by the measure of the consciousness that experienced it. The cutting beam, when it fired, was 0.4 degrees off its calculated trajectory. In deflector control, Obi-Wan felt the beam strike the shield boundary and was already moving. Lightsaber extended, force gathered into the finest point of focus he could manage in this thinned universe, touching the energy stream at its moment of contact with the shield emitter. He couldn't redirect it far. He couldn't do what he might have managed at full capacity in his own galaxy. But 0.4 degrees of existing variance plus the force-guided nudge of a kyber crystal in contact with a shield emitter was enough. The cutting beam deflected along the Enterprise's shield surface and discharged harmlessly into space. The deflector control room filled with the sharp smell of overloaded conduits and the blue-white flash of a lightsaber in contact with energies it was never designed to encounter. Obi-Wan was thrown back against the far bulkhead with enough force to crack 2 ribs, a fact he registered clinically and set aside for later attention. His lightsaber was still active in his hand. He was still conscious. The conduit behind him was sparking but intact. "Bridge," he said, slightly breathless, "the beam is deflected. Tell me you used that." Picard's voice came back instantly. "We did." "Well done. Are you functional? What's the cube doing?" "On the bridge," Data answered before Picard could. "The cube has stopped its approach vector, Captain. It is, holding position." A pause that contained genuine puzzlement. "It appears to be conducting an internal diagnostic. The collective is, redistributing processing resources." Another pause. "Captain, I am reading what appear to be localized disruptions within the cube's neural network. Multiple nodes showing anomalous activity simultaneously." Picard looked at Yoda, who had opened his eyes and was breathing with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a significant expenditure. "What did you do?" Picard asked quietly. "Reminded them," Yoda said, "of what they forgot." He paused, and the pause carried weight. "Cost, that has. Rest, I must. But hold they will, for a time." Troy was at his side immediately, her hand on his arm, her empathic senses reading the depletion in him with professional alarm. "He needs sickbay," she said to Picard, with the tone she used when her recommendation was not negotiable. Yoda looked at her with tired eyes that were still, underneath the exhaustion, luminously calm. "Correct, you are," he said. "Argue, I will not." It was the first time since their arrival that either Jedi had shown a limitation that was not theoretical. As Troy guided Yoda toward the turbolift, the bridge crew watched in silence with the specific quiet of people who have witnessed something they will spend considerable time thinking about afterward. The Borg cube held its position. Inside it, in 17 separate locations across 3 decks, drones stood motionless at their stations while the collective worked to suppress something it could not identify, could not assimilate, and could not explain. The persistent, irrational, extraordinarily durable phenomenon of a self remembering that it exists. Crusher kept Yoda in sickbay for 40 minutes before he politely and absolutely refused further treatment and returned to the bridge, moving with his cane at a pace that was slower than his arrival pace by a margin only Obi-Wan would have noticed. Obi-Wan noticed. He said nothing. Between them, across decades of partnership and disagreement and the particular intimacy of two people who had faced death together more times than either had counted, certain communications required no words. Yoda was depleted. Not dangerously, not yet, but the force in this universe was insufficient to replenish what he had spent at the rate he had spent it, and they both understood that the reserve he was operating on now was finite in a way it had never quite been at home. Obi-Wan's ribs had been treated by Crusher with a tissue regenerator that he found simultaneously remarkable and slightly unsettling. The sensation of bone knitting in real time was not one his experience had prepared him for, and he had returned to full physical function within 20 minutes. The Force, however, was another matter. The deflector control effort had cost him as well, the deep focus required to interact with Borg energy technology through a force that offered him perhaps 3/4 of its normal depth, having left him with the specific mental fatigue of someone who has been thinking very hard in a language they only partially speak. They stood together near the view screen and watched the Borg cube, which had not moved in 53 minutes and was doing something that Data continued to describe as anomalous internal processing and that Yoda continued to describe, when asked, simply as remembering. The Romulan warbird decloaked at 0541. It appeared between the Enterprise and the Borg cube with the theatrical timing of someone who had been waiting for precisely the right moment and had judged this to be it. Close enough to the cube to make its intentions ambiguous, close enough to the Enterprise to make retreat complicated. Commander Toritha's face appeared on the view screen with the composed authority of someone holding a considerably stronger hand than she was showing. "Captain Picard," she said. "It appears we find ourselves in a mutually inconvenient situation." "Commander," Picard replied, with the careful neutrality he deployed when someone was pointing something at him and calling it a coincidence. "Your presence in Federation space requires explanation. As does yours, given that you appear to have attracted Borg attention to a sector that was previously of mutual disinterest." Toritha's eyes moved, with precision that suggested she had been studying the bridge layout from her sensor data, to the two robed figures near the view screen. "I am here, Captain, because those two individuals represent something the Romulan Star Empire cannot allow the Federation to monopolize." "We are not Federation property," Obi-Wan said, with a pleasantness that contained something harder underneath it. Torith looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. She had read the sensor data. She had studied the reports from Bakral's probe. She had not, entirely, prepared herself for the reality of him. The quality of presence he carried, the sense of someone who had stood in front of considerably more dangerous things than a Romulan commander and had not found it necessary to adjust his posture. "No," she said, after a moment. "You are not. Which is precisely why this conversation should happen between us directly, rather than through the Federation's considerable bureaucratic instinct for committee." "What is it you want?" Picard said. "What the Empire always wants. Understanding of a new variable before our adversaries acquire it." She leaned forward slightly. "Those two carry something our instruments cannot classify. Something the Borg have now twice hesitated in the presence of. The Tal Shiar does not ignore variables that make the Borg hesitate." It was at this moment that Q appeared, which surprised no one and irritated everyone, manifesting in the space between Picard and the view screen with a glass of something in his hand and the expression of someone who has been watching a chess game and has decided the players need guidance. "Oh, this is getting complicated," he said approvingly. Borg on one side, Romulans on the other, two displaced mystics in the middle, and a Starfleet captain trying to hold it all together with protocol and Earl Grey. He sipped his drink. "Magnificent." "Q," Picard said, with considerable restraint. "Don't give me that tone, Picard. I'm the only one in this system who can actually resolve this, and everyone knows it." He turned to the Jedi. "I could remove the Borg cube." Snap, he raised his fingers. "Gone." I could send the Romulans back across the neutral zone with their dignity mostly intact. I could even send you home, which I offered earlier and you declined for reasons I found both admirable and exhausting. He lowered his hand. But I'm not going to do any of those things. Because none of them would address what's actually happening here. And what is actually happening? Obi-Wan said. Q looked at him with the seriousness he reserved for moments when performance had become insufficient. Something has followed you here, he said. Not the Borg. Not the Romulans. Something that was already here, waiting, and your arrival, the force you carry, even diminished, has drawn it toward the surface. He looked at Yoda. You felt it. In the Devron system. 3 days ago, before the rift. Yoda met his gaze steadily. Yes. What is it? Picard said. The continuum has no name for it, Q said, and the absence of theatrical elaboration made the statement more alarming than any amount of drama could have. It predates the Borg. It predates the Federation. It predates the Q, which is a sentence I have never in my existence had occasion to say and find deeply uncomfortable. He set down his glass, which disappeared before it could touch any surface. It exists in the space between dimensions, in the membrane between universes. Your arrival tore a small hole in that membrane. It is coming through. The ship's lights flickered. Not the controlled flicker of a power fluctuation or a weapon strike, something else. A quality of dimming, as though something vast had passed briefly between the Enterprise and its power source. Every console on the bridge registered a simultaneous anomalous reading and then returned to normal in the same instant. Troy made a sharp involuntary sound and pressed both hands to her temples. Deanna, Riker was at her side instantly. It's not, I'm all right, she steadied herself, breathing carefully. It's just, there's something out there that has no emotion. Not suppressed emotion, not controlled emotion. No emotion at all. Not even the Borg's collective purposefulness. She looked at Picard. It's like looking into something that has no interior. Nothing alive inside it. And it is enormous. Yoda had straightened, and despite the exhaustion Obi-Wan could feel in him through the Force, his eyes were entirely clear. He looked at Q. Stop it, can you? Q was quiet for a moment. Slow it, he said finally. Redirect it. By time. I cannot destroy what predates me. A pause that was, for Q, genuinely humble. I find that I am asking for help. Which is also a sentence I have never had occasion to say. Obi-Wan looked at Yoda. The look that passed between them covered considerable ground in a very short time, the recognition of a threat genuinely beyond their individual capacity, the assessment of what resources remained between them, the unspoken agreement about what came next. 40 years of partnership compressed into 3 seconds of eye contact. The Force, Obi-Wan said, is thin here. But it is present. And it is the same force that exists in our universe, the same underlying fabric. Just more loosely woven. He turned to Picard. In our experience, the Force responds to life. To consciousness. To the presence of living minds choosing, deliberately, to be aware of it. He looked around the bridge, at Riker, at Data, at Worf, at Troy still steadying herself, at LaForge who had appeared from engineering during the crisis. You are all alive. You all have minds capable of exactly the kind of focused awareness required. You're asking us to use the Force, Riker said. I'm asking you to be present, Obi-Wan said. Completely, deliberately, fully present. In our universe, that's where the Force begins. He looked at Picard. What you've built, the Federation, everything it represents, that's not so different from what the Jedi tried to build. Connection. Awareness. Responsibility toward life. A pause. We just gave it a different name. Picard held his gaze for a long moment. Then he turned to his crew and saw in their faces, one by one, the particular quality of readiness that 30 years of command had taught him to recognize, not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "All senior staff," he said quietly. "Whatever Master Kenobi requires." Yoda closed his eyes, and despite everything, the depletion, the unfamiliar universe, the thinness of the Force, the vast cold thing pressing through the dimensional membrane toward them, something in his ancient face settled into peace. He reached into the Force with everything he had left, and felt, for the first time since arriving, something unexpected. The Force, responding to the focused presence of every living mind on the bridge, was slightly less thin than it had been. Not much. But enough. What happened in the next 4 minutes and 17 seconds was not recorded accurately in any official Starfleet log, not because Picard ordered the record suppressed, he didn't, it was all there, timestamped and censor verified, but because the language available to Federation science for describing what occurred was approximately as adequate as a tricorder would be for measuring the depth of the ocean by dipping it in once and withdrawing it. Data's after-action report ran to 47 pages and concluded, with characteristic honesty, that the event had been documented completely and understood partially and that the partial understanding would require considerably more research to expand into anything resembling a full account. What the censors recorded. A dimensional membrane incursion of unprecedented scale, originating from the subspace layer beneath the Devron system, lasting 4 minutes and 17 seconds before retreating to its point of origin and collapsing the access point behind it. Energy readings consistent with no known phenomenon. Temporal variance across the affected area of 0.003 seconds, well within acceptable parameters. No casualties. No structural damage to the Enterprise beyond systems already compromised by the Borg engagement. The Borg cube, during the entire 4 minutes and 17 seconds, remained completely motionless. What the censors did not record, because they had no instruments calibrated for it, 2 Jedi Masters standing at the center of a bridge full of people who had chosen, deliberately and without full understanding of what they were choosing, to be completely present, and the Force. Thin, cold, insufficient by every standard either Jedi had ever worked within, becoming, in that of focused living consciousness, briefly and extraordinarily sufficient. Yoda had not attempted to fight the thing pressing through the membrane. Fighting was not the tool the situation required, and he had lived long enough to know the difference between problems that required force and problems that required something older and less dramatic. What he did instead was hold the boundary of the dimensional membrane the way a surgeon holds a wound closed, not with strength but with precision, with the knowledge of exactly where pressure was needed and in what direction. The Force, fed by the deliberate awareness of every mind on the bridge, gave him just enough to do it. Obi-Wan worked beside him in the way they had always worked best, complementary, each covering the ground the other couldn't reach. Where Yoda held the boundary, Obi-Wan moved along it, finding the points of greatest stress and addressing them with the focused, patient attention of someone who had spent 40 years learning that the most important work was rarely the most visible. His ribs ached. The Force was still thin. He worked anyway, because the alternative was unacceptable and Jedi did not choose their battles based on comfort. Q stood to one side and did something that none of the crew could observe directly but that Troy felt as a vast distributed pressure, like a hand pressing against a door from the other side, the Q continuum's power applied not as a weapon but as a brace, holding the dimensional structure stable while the Jedi worked within it. He said nothing during those 4 minutes and 17 seconds. For Q, silence of that duration and quality was the most honest thing he had ever expressed. Picard stood in the center of his bridge and did what he had always done in the moments that mattered most, he was present. Completely, deliberately, fully present. He felt nothing that he could have named as the Force. He experienced nothing supernatural or mystical. What he experienced was the specific quality of attention that a lifetime of exploration and command and genuine curiosity about the universe had built in him, an openness, a willingness to encounter what was real without the filter of what he expected. If that was what Obi-Wan had meant, then Picard understood it. It felt, he thought afterward, like the best version of what Starfleet had always aspired to be. The thing withdrew. Not defeated, nothing in the event suggested defeat in any conventional sense. It withdrew the way a tide withdraws, following its own logic, its own rhythm, responding to conditions that had changed in ways it had not anticipated. The dimensional membrane sealed behind it with a sound that no instrument recorded but that every person on the bridge heard, not with their ears but somewhere behind them, a resonance that lasted less than a second and felt like the closing of something very large and very old. The light steadied. Troy exhaled. Data looked up from his console and said, with quiet precision, "The anomaly has resolved. All readings nominal. The Borg cube is departing. Maximum warp, bearing 147 Mark II. They are leaving the system." No one spoke for a moment. Then Riker said, "Did the Borg just retreat?" "It would appear so, Commander," Data said. "I believe the events of the past 4 minutes may have provided the collective with sufficient anomalous data to necessitate a full tactical reassessment before further engagement." A pause. "In simpler terms, we gave them something they need time to process." On the view screen, the Romulan warbird was still present. Toritha's face reappeared, and what Picard saw there was something he had not expected to see on a Tal Shiar commander's face, not defeat, not aggression, but a careful, contained version of the expression that crossed every sentient face when the universe had demonstrated that it was considerably larger and stranger than previously understood. "Captain Picard," she said. "What I have observed today will require considerable reflection, before it finds its way into any official Romulan report." A pause that was, by Romulan standards, almost candid. "I suspect the same is true for Starfleet." She looked at the two Jedi. "Whatever you are not a weapon. That distinction matters, even to the Tal Shiar." Another pause. "Even to me." She closed the channel. The warbird cloaked and was gone. Picard turned to the Jedi. Yoda was seated on the floor of the bridge. Not collapsed, simply sitting, cross-legged, with his cane across his knees and his eyes open in the particular stillness of someone who has given a great deal and is taking a measured moment to acknowledge that fact. Obi-Wan stood beside him with one hand resting on a console for support that he was not quite admitting he needed. "It will come back," Yoda said. "Not as alarm. As information." "Yes," Q said, from wherever Q was, his presence felt rather than seen. "Not today. Not this year. But the membrane is thinner now than it was. Your arrival did that." He materialized briefly, standing near the view screen with an expression that was, for the first time in Picard's experience of him, entirely without performance. "The rift is still open. Reduced, but present. You could go home." "Could," Yoda said. Q looked at him steadily. But the membrane," Obi-Wan said, "needs tending. Here, in this universe. From this side." He met Picard's eyes. "The Force is thin here. But it grows slightly less thin in the presence of the kind of awareness your people carry. The kind of civilization you've built." He paused. "We didn't come here intentionally. But we're beginning to think we came here necessarily." Picard was quiet for a long moment, the silence of a man turning something over carefully, respecting its weight. "If you stay," he said finally, "the Federation will have questions. Starfleet Command will have considerably more questions. There will be protocols, committees, classification debates. Bureaucracy," Obi-Wan said, with a smile that suggested this was not entirely unfamiliar territory. "Considerable bureaucracy," Picard confirmed. "But," and here his own expression shifted into the one his crew recognized as the captain making a decision that was not in any regulation but was entirely consistent with everything the regulations were trying to protect. "The Federation was built on the principle that the universe is larger and stranger and more extraordinary than we have yet imagined. You are evidence of that principle." He straightened slightly. You would be welcome here. Yoda opened his eyes fully and looked at Picard for a long moment with those ancient luminous eyes that had seen 9 centuries of the galaxy and had never, in all that time, entirely lost the capacity to find something new in it worth staying for. Decided, it is, he said. And so 2 Jedi found their home among the stars of a universe not their own, one governed by science and reason and the extraordinary, stubborn insistence that the best response to the unknown was curiosity rather than fear. Yoda would spend his remaining years aboard the Enterprise and later at a small academy on Bethesda, where the population's natural empathic sensitivity proved the most fertile ground in the Federation for the careful, patient cultivation of Force awareness. Obi-Wan would serve as an unofficial diplomatic liaison, his talent for finding the still point in impossible conflicts proving useful in ways that no Starfleet regulation had anticipated but every captain who worked with him was grateful for. The dimensional membrane held. The thing beyond it did not return within any timeline this story can follow. The Borg never fully processed what had happened in the Devron system, and 17 drones across 3 decks continued to experience, at irregular intervals, memories that the collective could neither explain nor suppress. And in the thin places between stars, where the Force moved quietly through a universe still learning to hear it, something listened that had always been there, waiting only to be noticed. Some journeys end where they were always meant to. Live long and prosper. More stories.